justice is a living thing. Freedom is a living thing. Privacy is a living thing. And it should relate to your daily life and what's important to you. And so the ability of the state to look at the internet is very, very different today than it was 25 years ago when it didn't exist. And so make the thing relevant to your daily lives. Make it relevant to what you think is important. Because that's what it's about. I mean, that's where we jumped from the forestry issues and the rights of barons 800 years ago to what matters, because that mattered to them then, to what matters to you today. Make it alive, make it relevant, make it applicable, make it important to yourself, because that's what will make it live.
Think about the world as you experience it. Think about how you interact with technology. Think about how you interact with the society around you. Think about what you can do and think about what you can't do. A lot of what was covered in Magna Carta was related to old feudal privileges that people felt had been eroded. What are the modern day equivalents? What is happening today that you may feel warrants special protection?
I think it is very important that they think about various human rights and not just the usual human rights that we talk about in the UK. So, for example, the right to environment. It's a really important right that maybe has not been talked about as much, or the right to cultural diversity, the right to one's culture, the right to work, the right to protest, etc. So what I would say to them is not focus on the rights that have been talked about and are being talked about every day in Western societies and especially in the UK, but think more about other contexts and other human rights violations that are happening at the moment, so that we can have a more encompassing Charter of Human Rights.
I think they should look at society in the round, in terms of British society, in every aspect. They should look at regional differences in terms of wealth distribution, in terms of how the economy across the country is very different. They should obviously look at issues regarding gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. I mean, they should try and take Britain in its entirety, or insofar as they can, look at a much wider spectrum of British society than is often the case in these types of conventions. Because I think the danger is you get a bunch of people that exaggerate from the southeast, middle class people from the southeast talking about middle class things. And I think an opportunity is afforded in something, the project you describe, of actually looking at a whole range of issues across a wide degree of regions. So they should be looking at the countryside. They should be looking at planning and all sorts of issues, I think. And then I think if they have that sort of holistic picture, I think there'll be quite an interesting document in terms of rights and responsibilities people have across the country, or should have across the country.
I'd advise them to look far, so not to just think of their own immediate environment or even the UK, but to look at what you see in the news every day. Look at how people's rights might be violated in countries around the world, and to think as well about how things have changed. Obviously, Magna Carta 800 years ago was a very, very different situation to the world situation today. So what new kinds of rights might people need today that weren't even thought of or applicable so many years ago?
Well, I think at one level it's quite a difficult job. As a lawmaker, making law is a lot more difficult once you start doing it than it seems when you're sort of chatting about it. I think the challenge for them is to work out in their own mind what is really matters. You know, what is it that they feel about the way we do things at the moment in respect of rights that could be improved? Because that's what they've got to then distill into any clauses that they're drafting.
It's important to understand the history of the Magna Carta because you can't look ahead unless you look back, and proper understanding of the history is important. Secondly would be the evolution. Secondly, to see where there is the real opportunities there are and what are the dangers for the future to our freedoms, and therefore what kind of future they want for themselves, and against that background to begin to draft a charter. But I think the important thing is the act of their engagement. And I hope that it is done through debate, because part of a good democratic process is the ability to debate and have a dialogue and come to a consensus. And I think the process is going to be just as important as the outcome.
I think it's very difficult to draft something from scratch when there's so much in the way of, to take two obvious examples, the American Constitution, the European Convention on Human Rights. To draft something from scratch is quite difficult because it's been done before. I would have thought myself that taking simple documents like those two documents and seeing what principles they embody, it would be a good start. I think one might start asking whether everything that's enshrined in them is what we want. I'd have thought the European Convention has very little that you could quarrel with. The American Constitution, well, certain articles like the right to bear arms might be more controversial. But then the more difficult question is, do you want a Bill of Rights or a Magna Carta which has more detail than the European Convention, or do you want to keep it very short and simple? And then you ask yourself, are there certain other rights you want to add? And there's a subtle further question. Are we too obsessed with rights and not interested in responsibilities? Now, it can be said that your right is my responsibility. If you have, but on the whole, people see rights, particularly in terms of constitutions and human rights conventions, in terms of rights against the state. But would it be sensible to extend it to rights as between individuals, and would it be sensible to extend it to responsibilities as well as rights? And then ask oneself, I talked a moment ago about timeless rights, are there rights which, and indeed responsibilities, which people may not have thought of in the past, and which now are around now? And I suppose another thought would be what's happened over the past 30 or 40 years, which younger people will be much more able to appreciate in a way than someone like me, is the effect of the enormous technological changes that have happened. One's very aware of the consequences in terms of privacy and in terms of defamation, the effect of the internet, of blogging and tweeting and so on. Now, how much one wants to go into that sort of detail is a difficult question. The American courts and the Strasbourg courts have developed the simple concepts in the Constitution and the Convention into quite a sophisticated set of principles. Do you want to let the courts do that and have a simple convention, or do you want to have a much fuller, more detailed convention, which gives the courts less wriggle room, but may, on the other hand, be less easy to develop?
Okay, think very hard about, your own experiences and the experiences about, of your parents and your parents' parents before them. Take that into consideration, because that will inform, the kind of rights that you think are most important for you going forward today. And I think that's the main kind of advice I'd give. Just kind of look at the experiences of people around you if you think you're stuck for ideas, and try and make that translate into the type of rights that you think are important for today.
Well, the first advice I'd give them is remember that as members of a democratic society, these are people from this country, are they? Mostly, yes. You have, of course, rights, but you also have responsibilities. And your prime responsibility is to safeguard the democracy that you have inherited and to hand it on in a more vibrant and a fitter form to future generations. And so, don't opt out. Get yourself involved. I couldn't care less what your individual political views may be, but please use the various forums that you have, councils, parliament, etc. Aspire to join some of them, play a part, and you have a responsibility as you go out into the world to make the society into which you were born a better society when you leave it than when you joined it.
I think it goes back to something quite simple, really, and that is, how do I want to live? And how do I want my friends and the people I know, my neighbours, to live? And what sort of society we want to create? And what sort of values underpin that society?
My advice to those looking at our Constitution would be to not to forget the roots of our freedoms, the importance of rights of free speech, a free parliament, a free press, a separate judiciary. These are the things on which our liberties are built. But then to meet the challenge of our age, in some ways we're a curiously, there are paradoxes. We're probably the best informed, or let's say we have more access to more information than ever in our history. And yet there are questions and doubts about participating in the democratic process, how well functioning our democracy is. And so I think that don't forget where we come from and the importance of what has been laid down by previous generations, but then to look at what are the contemporary challenges that face a society in trying to manage itself in a way that recognises the rights of the individual, but also is able to act collectively to deal with problems that we face.
Well, I think the advice I would give them is to ponder on the universality of the principles of Magna Carta and think about the significant numbers of people around the world who do not enjoy the basic rights that we do. But think also about some of the dilemmas and challenges that we're beginning to face, where the agenda of rights enshrined in legislation and rights created by courts, in some cases, is starting to impinge upon our everyday life. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen an acceleration of issues around the balance of rights of different groups of individuals at quite an alarming pace. It's taken us 800 years to get from Magna Carta to where we are today, but in the last few years we've started to see the courts, for example, involving themselves in a way which is quite novel in our Constitution, in creating new rights and limiting the ability of society to conduct itself in ways that traditionally it has. And I think we have to make sure that in our own society, in our advanced and democratic society, we make sure that that balance is kept at the right level in the way that allows society to function. And in societies that don't have the benefit of our democratic institutions, we have to keep pushing for those basic rights to be introduced.
I suppose you have to sort of step aside from your own comfort zone. You know, in other words, it's a little like Voltaire and his "I don't agree with what you say, but I fight to the death for your right to say it." And the same applies to recognise you might have to protect the rights of people who you don't like or whose views you don't necessarily represent. So don't just think about your own comforts and privileges. I also suppose you've got to think of modern threats that might not have been there. Whether they're through technology or the abuse of technology or the abuse of power, the facelessness of institutions because they're too remote. So I think it's trying to see if you can get down to first principles that says, how can I as a citizen have rights that relate to the European Union or the National Health Service or Ministry of Defence or the United Nations or anybody else of that kind. But try to sort of tie it back and say, if you think these organisations are legitimate, but you worry that they might abuse the citizen, how can you define your rights in ways that protect the independence of the citizen without destroying the effectiveness of the institution? That's the kind of balance I think you have to work for.
I guess I'm somewhat a product of my own research, as most academics are. And my own research looks at ideas of national identity and multiculturalism. And the more one does this sort of research, the more one sees that some of the documents that you're talking about, there's something quite reductionist about thinking about them as only legal or political documents. The American Bill of Rights was used to shape a conception of what it meant to be an American. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was used to shape a conception of what it meant to be a Canadian. It was part of Trudeau's vision. These fundamental documents, they're not only serving legal purposes, they're serving a national purpose. They are often depictions in some way of something fundamental of national life. And with this in mind, we might well do something important if we had a clause very, very similar to Canada's Section 27 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says that the Charter will be interpreted in a way that's sensitive to the multicultural heritage of Canadians. It was a way of saying that this country is not only a body of equal individual citizens, there are groups in this country. These groups have helped to shape its nature. Our legal and political regime must reflect that. And incidentally, Section 27 was also something that was inserted in place of a constitutional preamble, a poetic justification of what it meant to be Canadian. Something very similar might well be done here, might be used to shape debates about Britishness, Englishness, codifying what it means to be British, what it means to be English. Some sort of clause like that may well serve some important use to Britain's increasingly multicultural citizenry and defining the nation of the future.
Oh, I don't think it'd be as presumptuous to give them any advice. I think it's a fantastic initiative. I think it's a brilliant idea. And actually, I think that younger people in our society have got their own ideas. And I think they've largely been disenfranchised from expressing those ideas. This feels like a society that is looking after the older population at the expense of the younger. And in all sorts of ways. So I think it's really, really encouraging my advice would be that they should express themselves in the way and the ideas that they have in their own way. So often we ignore what younger people think and say, and I think it's to our detriment as a society. So it's up to them. They've got to come up with the ideas. They've got to think about what the challenges that are ahead. They've got to think about what sort of charter is required for them for the future, because in the end of the day, they are the future of our society. And it is extraordinary how little attention is being paid to the youth in Britain today. It's scandalous. And it's scandalous at all sorts of levels, whether it's the sort of university fees, or whether it's the decline in community services for young. They are paying the cost of crisis. And I think it's so I wouldn't offer them any solutions from my generation, having been the generation that created the crisis. So.